Hello everyone, welcome back to Dr. FC. And I know it's literally been 8 months, but I'm finally doing a Spongebob Season 3 episodes ranking. And I know you're probably wondering why it took so long, and my answer to that is I never really felt like watching all the episodes again, so I can do a fair ranking. But now that I'm ready, it's time to get into it. My least favorite SpongeBob episode in Season 3 is Doing Time. This one is a bit too crazy for me. Sure, it has its funny moments, but overall it's way too insane and nonsensical, even for SpongeBob. Like a few other episodes, such as I Was a Teenage Gary, this one crosses the line of insanity for me. I'm also not a Mrs. Puff fan, so an episode about her insanity and torture being around SpongeBob isn't the episode for me. And for a show made for children, it's kinda weird that it actually had no idea what was real and what wasn't real. But this is miles worse than any other one on the list. As Seen on TV is coming in at number 36, and I have nothing against this episode. It's not terrible, it's just kind of bland. Season 3 is definitely better than 2 and 1 in my opinion. Both of those ones have a lot of bad episodes, but this season is mostly good. This episode is pretty boring. There's nothing too interesting, and SpongeBob's stupidity is way more annoying than usual. In my opinion, Party Pooper Pants is the worst SpongeBob special in the entire show, which is why it comes in at number 35. This is a character SpongeBob's worst episode from this season. He is annoying and does not act like his normal self. In fact, every character in this episode is very annoying. They are all kinda assholes and it makes everything kinda awkward. This isn't even an interesting concept to me in the first place, and I don't think they execute it any better. Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 5 is easily the worst Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episode. It puts the two heroes against each other for such a stupid and idiotic reason. And then everything just goes back to normal and this whole episode just seems like a waste of time. I guess the best part was seeing the main character's superpowers. That was pretty funny. In fact, this episode is pretty funny. There's a lot of good jokes. But overall, this episode was way too stupid for me. New Student Starfish is another one of my least favorite type of SpongeBob episodes. And that is when SpongeBob and Patrick have a falling out and start to hate each other. I think they try to be emotional or something like that, but they are not. I just can't picture them starting to hate each other after seeing episodes where they seem so happy together. Also, Patrick is so insanely annoying in this episode. He's annoying in other ones, but even more in this one. And I've always had one problem with episodes like this. If Patrick and SpongeBob are such amazing friends and have known each other since birth, then how come they don't know what gets on their nerves? That's just a thought I've always had, because Patrick and SpongeBob always seem to make each other upset, but they don't seem like they realize why they make them upset. Weirdly enough, the two worst special episodes are in the best season of SpongeBob. Party Pooper Pants and The Sponge Who Could Fly are both not very good episodes. This one is better because at least it has a reason to be a longer episode, and it has some stuff with Patchy and Patty, which is always pretty entertaining, but it still has a stupid premise and is boring. And it's even worse because there's that stupid song in there. They try and throw a song in almost every special episode, but most of them suck. There's only a few good ones actually. Krabby Land comes in at number 31 because it's one of those episodes where Mr. Krabs is a jerk and is obnoxious and more annoying than he needs to be. I actually kinda enjoyed watching him get tortured, so that's a good thing. This episode is not funny, nor does it change your opinion on any of the characters. The premise is also very weird. It's about Mr. Krabs wanting to steal kids' money by making a shitty theme park. It's just kinda weird for a SpongeBob episode, and once again, it doesn't really execute the idea properly, so it's a pretty bad episode. Midlife Crustacean is the only episode I did not remember going into this video. And honestly, even though I just watched it, I still kinda forgot what happened. It's that boring. These last two episodes have been about Mr. Krabs. And I usually like him, but I guess this is not his strongest season because there are multiple episodes he's in that I dislike. But yeah, this episode is kinda forgettable. I Had an Accident is just a slow progression of SpongeBob going insane. It can be entertaining at times because it gives us a new look at the character, but this episode is not funny at all. SpongeBob's comedy is the strongest factor, so an episode that isn't very funny is a pretty bad episode in my book. This episode still makes the most of it for what it is, so at least it's not even worse. Also, that gorilla scene at the end was hilarious, so I'll give it that. Looking back at the season, I'm really starting to realize how much episodes there are that have Mr. Krabs as an over-exaggerated asshole with no regard for human emotions. And doing these rankings for these 3 seasons, I can now say that I don't even know if I like Mr. Krabs anymore, after looking back at all these terrible episodes. Anyway, Born Again Krabs might be the worst example of Mr. Krabs being an asshole. I think the Flying Dutchman saves this episode, to be honest. If he wasn't in it, it would be way lower. But he's always entertaining and adds a little to the episode. But it's still not the best because of Mr. Krabs being an asshole. Okay, Mr. Krabs has officially gone too far. Sure, Clams is funny and has some great moments, but once again, Mr. Krabs is incredibly annoying. In this one, there's kind of a reason for it. Obviously, his precious $1 millionth got stolen, but he still turns literally insane. Squidward and Spongebob carry the episode because they see exactly what we see, so it's cool to see what they do in this situation. But this is another one ruined by Mr. Krabs. SpongeGuard on Duty has to be one of the most forgettable episodes of SpongeBob, especially for me who doesn't like Larry the Lobster or the Goo Lagoon setting. It's definitely my least favorite part about the show. Also, having a white tip on your nose does not make you a lifeguard. I don't care how unrealistic and nonsensical this show is, that still kinda annoyed me. At least it has some funny scenes, but this episode is not that good. The Bully is an episode that I should hate like I do any other episode where SpongeBob gets bullied, but I surprisingly do not hate this episode. Sure, it can be annoying, and the whole idea is not my thing, but I think it's executed pretty well. I mean, I honestly don't know how you can make an episode where SpongeBob gets bullied better than this. Flats the Flounder is actually really funny, and the reveal that he can't actually do anything to SpongeBob because he's a sponge definitely contradicts some other episodes, but it's still very funny and satisfying. My Pretty Seahorse is the first one of these episodes in Season 3 where they are really good and funny, but they are nothing compared to the amazing episodes in this season. This one is less funny than the other ones, which is why it comes in at 24 instead of in the top 15 or even top 10. There's some funny moments obviously, but it's just not creative enough to be one of the better episodes of a really good season. Squidward episodes are always really good, and Can You Spare a Dime is no different. It focuses on what happens when Squidward loses his job and doesn't have to live with SpongeBob anymore. It's interesting because those are the 2 things he hates the most, but when he loses them, he goes through more torture than he ever has. He turns to a homeless loser looking for spare change, and SpongeBob is the one to get him out of it. But even though this is a good episode, it's not good enough to rank any higher. While No Weenies Allowed has a lot of memorable jokes and moments, too much of it is kinda boring. Any sequence with Weenie Hut Jr. is not very funny, and I'm not into the stuff where SpongeBob thinks he's better than everyone else. It can kinda come off as annoying. And the ending where he trips on ice isn't very funny to me. But there's tons of parts in this episode that turned into memes, so you gotta give it credit for that. It's a really good episode. A lot of people really like Ugg, but to me it kinda gets obnoxious after a while. It is just high because it's very creative. I won't say it's not creative, but to me the main 3 characters have very annoying voices in this episode. There's not even dialogue, they just make strange noises. I know it's absurd to compare SpongeBob to a movie that is considered a masterpiece, but this kinda reminds me of 2001: A Space Odyssey, and before you call me insane, it's because they both focus on their visuals and creativity rather than the dialogue, and to me it just doesn't really work for SpongeBob, but it's still a pretty creative and funny episode. Pranks-a-Lot is the same type of episode as My Pretty Seahorse. It is very funny, but it doesn't have anything to make it that next level. It's cool to see SpongeBob and Patrick come up with these stupid ideas, and it's cool to see them execute them. I don't have any flaws with this episode. It's funny, has cool character interactions, has a funny ending. It's not higher because there's nothing that makes this a very memorable episode. There's also no moments that you immediately think of in this episode, but it's still really good. Honestly, Missing Identity doesn't have anything that makes it this high on the list. It's really funny, it's creative, the characters are all really great, but just like Pranks-a-Lot, there's no scene or moment that makes this episode very memorable. In fact, this episode is barely better than any of the last 5 on the list, and the only reason it is this high is because I like the whole detective joke at the beginning of it, and the diner and how it's all abandoned and all that kind of stuff. That was pretty funny to me. but this episode isn't good enough to rank any higher than this. The Great Snail Race was way more funny than I remember. I remember not liking it because Squidward got on my nerves, and SpongeBob treating Gary was pretty annoying. But now that I watched it again, it's actually pretty funny. The whole Rocky idea was pretty funny as well. In fact, the ending is just really entertaining in general. I didn't like when SpongeBob bullied Gary to the point that he literally exploded, but he actually made up for it. A lot of times where characters bully each other in the show, the attempt to make up for it just comes off as lame, but this episode actually handles it really well. Wet Painters has an insane amount of memes, and for good reason. There are tons of insanely funny moments in this episode. Patrick might actually have his funniest episode in this one. He has so many memorable lines, and he actually kinda steals his show. This is one of the only episodes where he is my favorite character. In terms of comedy, this might be one of the best in this season. I mean, how many SpongeBob memes do you see around that come from this episode? And the fact that it's number 17 really shows how amazing this season is. One Crab's Trash would be in the top 10 in any other season of SpongeBob. But there are so many episodes in the season that are unforgettable and played a huge part in my childhood. So an episode that's really funny and creative like this isn't going to make the top 10. But this episode is still one of the true best Mr. Krabs episodes. The graveyard scene is honestly one of the most creative scenes in the entire show. And there's actually like action in this episode, and it's good too. This episode is really good. After watching all the season 3 episodes and writing this script, I've realized that Plankton is really not in the season that much. And I really like Plankton, so it's kinda weird that this is still probably my favorite season. But Plankton's Army is still a great Plankton episode. It gives us a backstory for Plankton, which is something that I was always interested in. Well, it's not actually a backstory, it's just kinda an explanation of his family and what other Plankton are like. The premise is creative and it's really interesting, which is why it kicks off my top 15. Just One Bite is another example of Squidward and SpongeBob having really good character interactions, which is one of my favorite parts of this show. They are always fun to watch when they're not bullying each other, and I love seeing Squidward, who's usually miserable, enjoying life. It's always really fun and gets me in a good mood. And in this one, Squidward is easily the best part. Him eating a Krabby Patty and really loving it is really fun to watch. This one is definitely better than number 15, and they will continue to get better down the list. Nasty Patty comes in so high just because it's so different than any other SpongeBob episode. The whole vibe you get watching it is much more dark than any episode in the season. All of the atmosphere is very dark instead of light and happy. In fact, this episode is not very happy at all. It just has tons of creativity, and Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob have great chemistry and are always fun to watch. And the cops are also hilarious as well. This episode is one of my favorite SpongeBob episodes of all time, and it's not even in the top 10. Just like Just One Bite, Snowball Effect consists of Squidward actually enjoying life, which like I said before is always fun to watch. There's also so much creativity in this episode. All of the snow walls that the main three build are entertaining, and I just realized that every snow episode of SpongeBob is really good. All the Christmas episodes are very entertaining and creative, and Snowball Effect is no different, but it doesn't quite make my top 10, or top 11. SpongeBob Meets the Strangler is kinda like Nasty Patty. It's way more dark and has a much more mature premise than most SpongeBob episodes. And every time there's an episode like this, it is always really good. The Strangler is actually hilarious. Him and SpongeBob are insanely fun to watch, and seeing SpongeBob making a literal criminal suffer just by being himself is literally hilarious. But it doesn't make my top 10 because my top 10 are actually some of my favorites of all time, and this isn't that good. Kicking off my top 10, I have Crab Board. This top 10 has multiple episodes that are actually hysterical. They don't have heart and aren't emotional or anything like that, they're just hilarious and crack me up. And Crabborg is the first of many. It's also very creative, and Mr. Krabs is hilarious as well. There's so many memorable lines and scenes in this one. The electro song that Mr. Krabs listens to and him dancing is hilarious. Not the Navy is one of the funniest lines of the season. Not the Navy! This episode is amazing and is definitely entertaining enough to make my top 10. The Algae is Always Greener is my favorite Plankton episode of all time, and there's a lot of good ones. Seeing everything mixed up and flip-flopped is entertaining and gives us a new respect for Mr. Krabs for having to deal with all this stuff. I mean, Plankton couldn't even last a day working for the Krusty Krab. This episode has way more heart than Crabborg, which is why it ranks higher, but number 8 is significantly better than this one. I'm starting to notice a trend with Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy episodes. I'm not going to say it right now, I'll talk about it later. Anyway, all of the good ones are hysterical. They don't have heart or emotion, they just have so many memorable moments that just leave you cracking up. While Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 4 is not as funny as Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 3, it is still hilarious. And the trend I noticed with these episodes is that all of the good ones don't have Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy as significant characters. In this one, SpongeBob is the main character, and in the third one, Man Ray steals the show. Maybe it's just because I don't find the heroes very funny, but anyway, this episode is still hilarious. Squilliam is kinda like Man Ray. He doesn't have any heart poured into him or anything like that, he is just hysterical. And Squilliam Returns is the best example of that. He basically gets an episode dedicated to him. I mean, that's awesome. An episode about this cocky loser making fun of Squidward is literally a perfect episode for me. Even though they hate each other and try to compete and make each other look bad, I think they have great chemistry. They're always fun to watch, and I love seeing them triumph on each other and embarrass themselves in front of each other. This episode is also hilarious, mostly because of Squilliam. He is definitely one of my favorite characters in the show. Club SpongeBob comes in at number 6 for many reasons. Everything good about SpongeBob is showcased in this episode. It is great comedy with memorable jokes and creative scenarios that always make for great moments. The character interactions and chemistry are also great in this episode. And it has heart as well. Almost every episode that is high in these rankings has heart, and this is no different. This episode is also extremely creative. The premise is great where the main 3 characters just let their interactions take over, and it makes for some great scenes. The first episode in my top 5 is Idiot Box. I mean, I think it's pretty clear already that I really like the creativity of SpongeBob. And the main premise of this episode is literally SpongeBob and Patrick using their imagination to create scenarios in a literal box. And there's also another one of my favorite parts about SpongeBob in this episode, which is Squidward, SpongeBob, and Patrick interacting with each other without torturing each other. I think the main 3 have great chemistry when they are not putting each other in severe trauma, and this is a great example of that. They bounce off each other so well, and this episode is the perfect example of that. I just said example of that twice, but whatever. Honestly, my number 4 pick, the camping episode, doesn't have too much to analyze. It's hilarious, has a funny song that became a meme, it's creative, and all the characters have great chemistry. Season 3 for me is the best season for the main trio of the show. And this is another episode focusing on the main 3 characters. It also follows a similar formula as other good episodes that have these 3 as the main attraction. They actually have good chemistry, just like an Idiot Box, which always makes for a great episode. And the sea bear joke at the end is very funny and memorable. Rockabye Bivalve is one of, if not the most underrated SpongeBob episode of all time. It's funny, it's creative, it's full of heart, and it adds on to one of the best character relationships, being SpongeBob and Patrick. I'm not sure why not everyone loves this episode like I do. Every scene is funny. Even the parts where SpongeBob and Patrick are mad at each other will still leave you cracking up. Seeing Patrick's so-called job end up just being him lazy, watching TV, and eating food, it should make me get mad at him, but instead I can't help but laugh because it's just executed so well. And then they start to become friends again after a little baby clam thing learns to fly. Should make no sense, but instead it's just hilarious. I love this episode, and it could definitely be number 2, but the top 2 are just a little bit better. Just missing out on the first place spot is the Krusty Krab training video. While this episode is indeed hilarious and creative, full of memorable jokes that stick with you for a long time after watching the episode, for me this is such a good one and ranks so high because it does a great job at putting us in the eyes of the main characters. It puts us in the perspective of a Krusty Krab employee, and it makes us think about what it would be like to work in the restaurant. We see what Squidward is like in the eye of a worker and what he would be like to work with. It gives us a view on what the Krabby Patty is like, a holy burger that is a main attraction for the restaurant. It's really cool, but I think it would be even better if it took place in Season 1. In my Season 2 ranking, I said there was one episode I liked better than Band Geeks, and in case you were wondering what that was, it is Chocolate with Nuts. Comedy. Arguably my favorite thing in the entire world is comedy. Sadness, creativity, shock, and many more emotions can make a show or movie great, but comedy might be the number one thing, especially in a show about a talking sponge who works at a burger restaurant and lives in a pineapple. And in Chocolate with Nuts, I experience comedy at its finest. The jokes are all set up great. They are executed greatly and have some form of shock value, and after the joke is done, the reactions from the characters and what happens after the joke is satisfying and adds a little extra, well, comedy to the joke. There are so many jokes and scenes in this episode that are hilarious. They will leave me laughing for a while, but then 1 second later another joke will happen that will seem funnier than the last. This is also extremely creative with great character interactions with everyone in the show. Even one-time characters have great chemistry with SpongeBob and Patrick. I love this episode and it is one of my favorite TV episodes ever. Well, after a very long time, I finally felt up to the task of making a Season 3 SpongeBob episode ranking, and here it is. I hope you enjoyed and I'll see you next time, and I will not be doing a Season 4 ranking, or a Season 5, or any other season. This is my last one. It gets kind of boring after a while just watching and writing and then recording and editing and all that stuff, so yeah, this will be the last time I'll talk about SpongeBob. But I'll see you next time in the next video.